Next from Springfield, we head to a press conference where legislators and law enforcement officials discuss a bill that would allow for police body cameras and other police reforms. This runs about 20 minutes.
That we are having offices where body cams on every day that they're out there interacting, and the trigger for them to turn it on is when they're going to interact with the public. So there's going to be a lot of video, right? We don't want to just be putting all of, we don't want Big Brother to just be, maybe we're going towards that day since we have cameras all over the place, but the flagging of video is what is important. So we put in provisions for flagging a video. We're trying to be mindful of the fact that there's going to be a lot of data out there, and so we need to be mindful of that because there's costs associated with that as well.
And then, so you said it turns on when there is going to be interaction with the public, like in a certain situation, or if I'm walking around, or how is it determined when the camera starts recording?
The camera's on for whatever the shift a person is on, but when in an interaction with the public, you have to hit record. So the camera will always be on. That's why it's that 30-second pre-event recording. So it's like that with the traffic cams. Dash cams. I think my department where I used to work at, it was like a minute, where it recorded a minute of pre-event, but there was no audio to it. It was just video. So does that answer your question?
I think so. So basically, it's kind of recording all the time.
It's recording basically all the time for 30.
When I actually press record, it keeps that 30 seconds
Correct.
prior.
That's right.
And they have to turn it on. What?
Sure. If you're on a potty break.
Like, if I am just approaching somebody, not even to make an arrest, just if I want to chat with somebody because something looks fishy, or what constitutes a?
Well, one of the things that we recognize is, an officer cannot necessarily predict when something is going to happen. And so when an officer, let's say it's an officer in a patrol car, pulls up on the scene and is going to step out of the vehicle to interact with a member of the public, then he or she would turn it on to record. There are circumstances that we recognize where an officer may be reporting to a scene, let's say in somebody's home, where there may be a reasonable expectation of privacy. And in those situations, notice would have to be given and consented.
So if I'm going to somebody's house and say, hey, I've got to record this by law, or
I'll give you an example. As law enforcement officers, we're sent to give death notifications. That's an interaction with the public, but that's not something that we want on camera. There's also a caretaking function part of it too. If you're going to go check the well-being of an individual, well, there's no criminality involved in that, so you wouldn't have to hit the record on the button. Now, if something happened or transpired while that happened, you hit the record button. And I think it not only does it protect the officer, but it also protects the individual that they're meeting with. So
what is that? I'm sorry. What if you don't press record? What if either, you forget, it gets busy, or maybe something nefarious is going on, maybe they intentionally don't press record. What are the disciplinary actions?
Well, we looked at those scenarios in particular, and if it's something you can prove that the person was willful in not turning on the camera, that would be a violation of departmental policy. But if it's accidental, that's why we built in language as soon as practicable. So if the circumstances that Representative Anthony pointed out, so a person goes to give the death notification, and during the course of giving the death notification, something transpires where the situation changes. The person, while the officer's trying to deal with the situation and calm down the situation, we wouldn't want the officer to discard his safety and trying to worry about putting on the camera. So we wanted to make sure that as soon as it was practicable and it was safe for him, then he or she could turn the camera back on. So, but in those situations, we wanted to be mindful of, officer safety, and we didn't want the officer to be so worried about trying to get the camera on that he forgot about his own safety.
So that it's not any sort of criminal penalty or fine. It's up to a department to determine if there was a willful, if there was an intention.
Correct.
not
So
to.
we left that discretion to the department via their departmental policies, because we know each situation is different. And we wanted to make sure we put in a baseline set of protocols that departments and officers could follow.
Mr. Smoot, can you give an example of something in that national report that's not part of this that should have been?
Well, I think, I think we've made a great first step. You know, the entire task force report is predicated on changing the culture of police departments and having police departments really as their cornerstone philosophy be procedural justice. And obviously, that's not something we can legislate, but by building into the initial training and then in-service training requirements, a procedural justice training requirement, we will start to do that. And that will ultimately, I think, have a very significant impact on the way police departments operate in the state of Illinois and other places.
That is a recommendation from the report.
That is one of the seminal recommendations.
Describe what you mean by procedural justice on this view.
Well, there's really two different elements to it. One is an internal procedural justice, and one is external procedural justice. And it really boils down to how the people who are interacting feel about the interaction. So within the department, what we found, for instance, the Chicago Police Department has implemented a procedural justice in-service training program. I think it's about a 14-hour program. Over 2,000 Chicago police officers have already had the training. And it's based on how you conduct your communication and transaction with members of the community, with members of the public. And so, you know, oftentimes it's not whether or not somebody gets a ticket that forms their impression of the interaction with the police. It's how the officer communicated with the person and how the decision was made, whether they got a ticket or not, how they were presented with the ticket. What we found in exit surveys in the Chicago Police Department is like the #1 question that officers ask after they go through this training about how to treat people fairly and how to, you know, conduct yourself in a way that people come away from it feeling like you treated them fairly is, have the people in my department had this training? The supervisors in my department had this training? That's a weakness that we have, and it's not, I'm not picking on Chicago, that's a weakness in many police departments, probably most, is that internal procedural justice part. Do officers feel like their departments treat them fairly? And I think it's one of the things that was recognized by the task force and that's talked about in the task force report is it's not very realistic to expect people to go out and treat the customer or the public in a way that's different than how they're treated by their own employer. And so by integrating that procedural justice training component, not only to the basic training, but also to in-service training, you know, we hope that that will pick up and then permeate out not only within departments, but then also outside police departments as well.
And is that training mandated in the legislation?
Yes, it is.
Sean, do you know how will the officers, or John Anthony, how will the officers react to wearing this? Are they happy about this, or is it something that they think is when we're in position?
To wearing body cameras? I think it's a bit of a mixed bag. You know, some officers are cautious. They're cautious by nature and suspicious by nature. That's what how we train them to be. Some of them will view this as a you know, potential way to have the department, you know, get a gotcha for frivolous things like, you know, maybe you didn't have your hat on or something like that. But I think a majority of officers, particularly officers with 10 years or less on the department, they're very comfortable with technology. They're very comfortable with, you know, cameras and phones and those kinds of things. And I think that there's a realization that the fact of the matter is, and the research bears this out, that in over 95% of the cases where interactions are conducted and there's a video and a complaint is made, the officer's actions, in fact, are found to be correct and within policy. And so they really view that as as kind of a protection from false complaints. But I think all of them recognize that this is a tremendous tool for evidence collection. And I really think that that's, you know, our focus tends to be accountability, and we're doing this to, you know, to catch officers who are misbehaving. You know, the goal and the real reason for having body cameras is the same reason officers carry all of the other tools that they carry when they put on their uniform or get in their squad car, and that is to assist them in doing their job. And part of their job is collecting the best evidence possible that can be used in criminal prosecutions later on.
You should mention that we have a provision to try to prevent against using it for minor infractions.
Right. Thank you very much for reminding me of that. But there is actually a provision in the law that limits departments' ability to use these cameras to discipline officers for the minor infractions that, you know, things that like I talked about. Well, I think, yeah, and I've given a pretty exhaustive testimony on this topic in both the Senate and the House and in a joint committee. These cameras will not be the panacea that many people think they will. And then, you know, back to Terry's question, you know, will officers, you know, view this as a negative thing? They're not going to be the Pandora's box that officers fear that they're going to be either. I think, you know, it's just another tool. And if people have unrealistic expectations, I'm glad you asked the question, because I think there are some unrealistic expectations out there.
To that point, that's why the training is so important. That's why we focused a lot in the bill on training. We wanted to make sure that the annual in-service training was there, that there was the 3-year requirement for in-service training, and to expand the training, including implicit bias, cultural competency, identification of anyone who's suffering from addictive services, somewhat dealing with people who are victims of sexual assault. That's why we wanted to make sure we focused on the training part too, because we're not going to get these are nothing. No one thing is going to be a silver bullet, but we've got to put in place give the officers the tools on a wide variety of topics to help them be successful, and I think they will be. I think it's also important to note that included in the language is a clarification on the recently passed eavesdropping law. So we placed in there that, you know, officers are not allowed to prohibit someone who's taping them or videotaping them during the course of their doing their day-to-day duties, their on-duty duties. So I think that was critical for us to make sure we put that clarification there as well.
You called this a good first step. Does that mean you can expect to see some more legislation in the next session?
I think what you'll see, that's part of why the commission's there. The commission is going to be there to examine some other items and other issues. I would hope that we let this law work. I think we sometimes have a tendency to pass a law and then come back and try to fix the law before the laws even had a chance to work. But I think let's let this law play out. Let's see how this law is implemented. Let's see how we get the benefits from it, the training, the additional training, things like that. Let's see how that plays out.
And there's no funding stream to help municipalities pay. That's something that you want, or is there a grant in any sort of allocation?
Well, how we're going to pay for the body cameras and to pay for the additional training there, we're asking we're going to increase traffic tickets by $5. $2 of that will go towards funding of the grants for body cameras. The other $3 will go towards training through the Illinois Law Enforcement Training and Standards Board. So that for the additional training that we're asking to do, and if you look at the legislation, there are many parts throughout the bill where we talk about the board. We add requirements for the board, so we want to give them the resources to make them be successful as well.
So any traffic citation gets $5 more, and then
Yes.
it goes into a fund and
Yeah,
municipalities
there's already a fund created for the in-dash cameras, so we just expanded. We're gonna put those funds into that, put the proceeds into that fund, and municipalities can apply. What we did also, because there are some municipalities there, and included in the bill is we put a compliance requirement. So if you have been complying with the additional reporting requirements that we've set out, those municipalities would have priority. Will have priority over other municipalities who are not complying with the reporting requirements.
Is there anything in this legislation or anything planned to expand any whistleblower protections for any police officers who might want to come forward with wrongdoing that fear retaliation?
I would certainly say that we're not going to shut down any options or ideas from another member who would look at filing a bill. That was not part of this discussion.
I think there's already a pretty strong whistleblower protection.
That's what I was getting ready to say. There's already a pretty strong whistleblower protection. And I said this, I think it was in committee or somewhere. But remember this, good cops hate bad cops. Don't forget that. So if there's a bad cop, he will get rooted out.
And just very quickly, that thing you said at the beginning about looking down after an event,
Yeah.
would you explain that?
Well, basically, if there's crime out there, what you'll start seeing is less interactions. That's why we have to be very careful and cautious in our approach to whatever this police reform looked like. If you saw the movie, you saw the officer just literally put his head down because crime was taking place and he didn't do anything about it. I mean, you look at Baltimore, look at what's happening out there right now. 36 shootings or deaths in 1 month. You have to be cautious and careful with police reforms, and I think we did that with this bill. Well, you know, there was a group of us that got together about 5 months ago to begin to talk about a framework of coming in with some real criminal justice or police reforms, I should say. We got together about 5 months ago, and then we actually started and met. The meeting happened about a month ago. You had law enforcement, you had law enforcement unions, the FOPs, you had the press association, and then you had legislators, and we all came together. And I think we had about 7 or 8 meetings and just hashed out what real true police reform should look like. One of the issues that I had with an issue was that we needed to be very careful and cautious of how we dealt with police reforms. You know, I know sometimes the legislator likes to legislate from the headlines, and I was afraid of that. But I have to say that Chairman Kwame Raoul, who's a senator, and Chairman Elgie Sims, who's a representative, really took a careful and cautious approach to how we actually did this. There were 31 bills filed dealing with police reform, and some of them were way outrageous. And we were able to find some common ground on, I believe, the 9 that we actually filed.
Okay, and what were a few other ones? Because right now, the major one that we discussed was the body camera, which is a major progress or a significant one. It was said that Illinois is one of the first ones to do something like.
After today's passage of this bill, we will be the first in the nation to pass this. One of the things that concerned me was there was a chokehold bill that actually had a Class 1 felony if an officer used the chokehold. But there was no amendments attached to this bill. So when I initially saw that I had real concern. But that bill wasn't in there. Although the chokehold was mentioned in the bill, a lot of it is already what's standard practice. No agency in the state of Illinois, I'll say, teaches the chokehold. Not one agency. And it's actually against department policy to choke someone out unless there was an exigent circumstance or there was an area where you needed to save your life. There's a necessity defense that will cover the officer from that angle.
Okay, so in discussing that chokehold bill, it would be a Class 1 felony?
It would have been, but that's no longer there. That isn't in this language. It just simply says, basically an officer would violate departmental policy, and then the local sheriff or chief would deal out or will give out the so-called punishment of what would happen if a person just simply choked someone out just because they felt like it. That's a crime. So.
Okay, and back to Senate Bill 1304, which is allowing police body cameras. It's not a mandate, correct?
Yeah, well, one of the first discussions that Senator Kwame Raoul and I had, because initially the bill, I believe, was going to be a mandate. And in discussing having a very ongoing discussion with Senator Kwame Raoul, after talking about it with him, he determined that it shouldn't be a mandate because of cost. This is going to cost departments a lot of money. Not so much the cameras, but the storage of the data. That's where the major cost is going to come in at. When you look at traffic cams now, storing that data, you have to repeatedly, if it's not something that's flagged, you have to get rid of it real quickly because the data begins to store up really quick. So,
Okay. And that bill will be called up to the House today?
as you heard Chairman Sims state, it will be called to the House floor on today.